June 6th, 1944. Off the coast of Normandy, the gray dawn rolled across the channel like cold smoke. Lieutenant Commander Harold West stood on the deck of HMS Bulldog, clipboard in hand, while the wind drove a fine mist over the sea. Around him stretched a formation that seemed to defy belief: tugboats, floating pontoons, blockships, caissons, and cranes. It was not a fleet in the traditional sense, but an assembly line of steel and concrete. 5 million tons of it, creeping toward France at 4 knots. The men on deck didn't yet call it Mulberry. They just knew it had to work. Yet, by dawn of June 7th, reconnaissance flights confirmed the impossible rows of caissons forming a breakwater, trucks moving along floating roads, and cranes unloading supplies directly onto the beaches. The laughter stopped. At 600, the first fully loaded truck rolled down a whale roadway onto Gold Beach. A British corporal marked the moment in his log: pier operational. Within 48 hours, 8,000 tons of cargo passed through the new harbor. The figures astonished even the planners. It was crude, vulnerable, and incomplete, but it worked. That night, as West stood again on the deck watching the tide push against the concrete walls, he thought of the men who had called it madness 2 years earlier in London. They had not been wrong about the risks. Half the caissons were cracked, several pontoons gone, and another storm could erase everything. But for the moment, under the dim glow of signal lamps and tracer fire, the impossible harbor held. June 7th, 1944. Arromanches sector, Normandy coast. The first night ashore had been sleepless for most of the Royal Engineers. Lieutenant Commander Harold West returned to his launch at 430 after 30 hours awake. The harbor, still incomplete, groaned like a living machine. Each tide revealed new cracks in the concrete, new cables snapped by the strain of surf and current. The Phoenix caissons settled unevenly overnight. Some listed several degrees, forming leaks that gurgled beneath the waves. Divers went over the side in heavy canvas suits, weighted boots sinking into the sand. Their air hoses hissed under the morning wind. Every minute counted. By 900, German aircraft were expected again. On shore, cranes began unloading the first prefabricated bridge spans from flat-bottomed barges. The whales had survived the night better than expected. Section A's pontoons rode the swell in near-perfect rhythm, though one beetle had broken its mooring and drifted inland to smash against a tank trap. Sergeant Miller's crew welded new joints under shell fire, cutting and joining beams on the open deck. The men worked by stopwatch 5 minutes per weld before the tide covered the plates again. By noon, 60 yards of roadway connected the pierhead to the beach. Through the narrow corridor, lorries rolled one at a time, bringing fuel drums and ammunition boxes from the waiting Liberty ships offshore. Each vehicle carried exactly 2 tons, and each crossing took 8 minutes. Efficiency determined survival. To the east, smoke rose from Omaha Beach, where the American harbor, Mulberry A, fought its own battles with surf and wreckage. Reports filtered through the radio net. One Phoenix capsized, several beetles torn loose. West made a note, but said nothing. His own harbor was marginally steadier, sheltered by a natural curve of coastline. Still, the numbers worried him. 23 caissons had been planned for the western breakwater. Only 19 stood. If the weather worsened, the whole system could unravel in hours. He sent a coded message to Portsmouth requesting 2 replacements. The reply came back brief: None available. Make do. By mid-afternoon, enemy artillery began probing again from beyond Bayou. Shells fell short, splashing harmlessly around the outer line, but each detonation rattled the caissons. The harbor cranes kept moving. Flat cars of ammunition rolled down the floating roads, unloading onto trucks that idled with engines running. The roar of motors blended with the rhythmic clang of steel on steel. A corporal from the 79th Engineer Battalion recorded in his notebook, "Feels like building a city in a storm." He wasn't wrong. By dusk, over 1,500 tons of supplies had crossed those improvised roads, fuel, rations, and field guns, enough to keep 3 divisions fighting another day. At 1,900 hours, the tide reached its peak. The caissons rose 6 feet. Mooring cables stretched tight as piano wire. The floating pierheads flexed and moaned. A U.S. Navy tug pushed a damaged Beetle into position, while British gunners on the cliffs fired counter-battery shells inland. Every man understood the stakes. If the harbor failed, the invasion front would stall, and every casualty on the beaches would have been for nothing. West stood near the edge of Pierhead 2, oil and salt staining his coat. "Hold it steady," he muttered to no one. The sea answered with another burst of spray. By nightfall, German bombers approached. Searchlights stabbed the clouds, catching a Heinkel 111 as it lined up for a run. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire from the breakwater ships. Tracers arced red and white through the mist. The bomber dropped 2 bombs short. Geysers of water drenched the nearest pontoon. None hit. The men cheered briefly, then went back to work. Crews from the Bulldog ferried out replacement moorings, threading steel cables through rolling surf. Engineers on the caissons hammered anchor pins deep into the sand, working by the flicker of signal lamps. At 2,330, the sea calmed. A cold mist crept across the channel. West inspected the damage reports. 4 spans warped, 1 caisson leaking, 1 Beetle missing. Losses acceptable. He penciled a line under the total and closed his notebook. Across the water, the silhouettes of Liberty ships waited like mountains. Their holds contained another 20,000 tons of cargo, ready to unload at first light. The harbor, unfinished, battered, improvised, was already functioning beyond its design. Just before dawn on June 8th, a convoy of ambulances rolled across the floating roads toward the waiting ships. Without it, the invasion would starve on its own beach. At 430, the first section of Gooseberry block ships sighted the French coast through drifting fog. Old freighters and tankers, stripped of machinery and packed with concrete, were to be scuttled in a precise line to form a breakwater. Every position had been plotted weeks in advance, every tide charted to the inch. The captain of the Empire broadsword carried sealed orders specifying his exact latitude and time of detonation. If one ship sank too early or too far out, the entire harbor alignment would fail. The return cargo was men wounded from the first assaults at Bayou and Tilly-sur-Seulles. They moved silently, bandages white under the lanterns. The same structures built for invasion now served as escape. West watched them pass without comment. The engineers nearby checked bolts and cables, noting flex points. Maintenance began the moment each truck cleared the ramp. At 600, a coded weather report arrived from the Channel Meteorological Station. Low pressure building west of Ireland, moving east. Another storm in 48 hours. The men exchanged glances but kept working. There was no alternative. Each ton landed today meant fewer lives risked tomorrow. When the first light touched the water, the half-built harbor gleamed gray and metallic, stretching like a spine from the French shore. It was ugly, unstable, and temporary, but it was enough. June 8th, 1944. English Channel, 50 miles south of Portsmouth. The wind had risen through the night, lifting a short, steep swell that slammed into every hull heading toward Normandy. Captain Douglas Henry of Tug Convoy, 27B, stood on his bridge at 430, the deck pitching under his boots. Behind him stretched a column of 6 tugs, each towing a Phoenix caisson bound for the incomplete western wall of Mulberry Bay. The convoy moved at barely 3 knots. Every wave that broke across the tow cables threatened to snap them. Each caisson weighed thousands of tons. Once adrift, none could be recovered. Henry's orders were blunt: deliver the final section before the weather turned. By dawn, the channel looked like molten lead. Visibility dropped to a few hundred yards. On the horizon, the outlines of earlier convoys vanished in spray. The wireless carried constant reports: grounded barges, drifting beetles, one tug lost near the Isle of Wight. Henry's first mate marked each incident on a clipboard without comment. Their own tow, Phoenix 42, rolled sluggishly in the swell, half submerged and straining its cables. At 930, a wave taller than the tug itself slammed broadside, throwing men against the rails. One winch mount tore loose. Henry ordered the auxiliary engine engaged and reduced speed. If they didn't reach the anchorage by nightfall, the harbor might lose its final piece. At Arromanches, Lieutenant Commander West was already awake, checking tide charts spread across a plank table. His voice was hoarse from 2 nights of shouting over wind and gunfire. The harbor was functioning, barely. 2 pierheads open, 1 closed for repairs. Supply throughput had reached 2,700 tons per day, but the goal remained 7,000. Every additional caisson meant greater protection, fewer interruptions, and less time wasted waiting for calm seas. At 1,100, he received word of Henry's convoy. The forecast predicted gale force winds within 24 hours. If the Phoenixes failed to arrive before the storm, no other chance would come for a week. Throughout the afternoon, the sea worsened. Crews reinforced moorings with doubled chains and filled ballast tanks on the outermost caissons. Divers reported sand scouring beneath several bases, eroding their stability. Engineers pumped concrete through flexible pipes to fill the gaps. Onshore workshops welded new bridge sections, while cranes swung in a slow, continuous rhythm. The air smelled of diesel, hot metal, and salt. Overhead, fighter patrols passed low, their engines echoing against the steel surfaces. Every man knew what was coming weather that might undo all their work. At 1,615, Henry's convoy reached the outer approach. The signal lamps from the harbor blinked clearance. The sea was a field of whitecaps, spray breaking over the tugs in sheets. Henry ordered half speed. The first Phoenix entered position at 1,750. Its valves were opened manually by a team of engineers standing ankle-deep on the deck as it began to settle. The process required precision. 1 compartment, flooded at a time so the structure would sink upright. The wind made it almost impossible. Radio traffic from Bulldog carried West's calm instructions, course corrections, bearing adjustments, flood rates to the second. By nightfall, 4 of the 6 caissons were down. The 5th jammed a valve and listed 15 degrees. Divers couldn't reach it until morning. Henry's exhausted crew secured the 6th alongside and cut loose their cables. Rain began before midnight. The first squall swept in from the west, sheets of water driven by 40-knot gusts. By 200 on June 9th, the entire Mulberry was under assault. Waves 10 feet high smashed against the breakwaters. The Phoenix walls shuddered, but held. One beetle broke free, its roadway span twisting until it tore away from the pierhead. Trucks halted halfway across, reversing carefully down the slick steel. Every hour, engineers reported new failures, anchor pins sheared, bolts loosened, pontoon seams leaking. Orders were reduced to a few essentials: keep the caissons in place, keep the roads attached, and protect the pierheads at all cost. At first light, the storm intensified. Wind speed climbed to 50 miles per hour. The sea turned white with foam. The western breakwater, completed only hours earlier, took the full impact. 2 Phoenixes shifted several feet, dragging their anchor chains taut as bowstrings. West stood on the command platform, gripping the railing, his uniform soaked through. "If they drift, we lose the harbor," he said quietly. Men worked along the decks, securing lines that whipped like live cables. A barge carrying replacement beetles capsized, its crew rescued by lifeboat in the surf. Radio contact with Portsmouth failed. The engineers were on their own. By evening, the gale reached its peak. Each man aboard knew he was part of something that had never been attempted in human history, building a port from nothing, under fire. By 600, German coastal batteries near Arromanches had woken. Plumes of water rose among the block ships. One 88 M&M shell struck the Sumatra's stern, killing 6 men outright. She went down early, but the tugs adjusted formation, hauling her neighbor a few yards east to close the gap. Precision under fire became instinct. Engineers aboard the Bulldog logged each sinking on their charts. Caissons slammed together with a sound like cannon fire. The outer wall disappeared under spray. Yet the inner harbor, protected by the massive barrier now half complete, remained calm enough for 2 Liberty ships to unload. Their cranes swung steadily through rain and wind, lowering trucks, fuel drums, and artillery pieces onto the floating roads that refused to break. In the chaos of the storm, the concept proved itself. The harbor survived because it existed at all. When the sky finally cleared late on June 10th, wreckage littered the water. Dozens of pontoons gone, several caissons cracked, one completely submerged. But the core remained standing. The sea was calmer, the wind reduced to a stiff breeze. West wrote in his log, "Harbor operational, damage severe but repairable. Weather test passed." On shore, soldiers cheered as the first new convoy came in under the morning sun, their cargo holds full. Against every expectation, the floating port still lived. June 11th, 1944. Arromanches, Normandy. The storm had passed, leaving a film of wreckage across the beach. Timber, twisted steel, fragments of pontoons, and hundreds of empty fuel drums floated in the surf. Lieutenant Commander Harold West and his engineers began the day at 430, cataloging damage section by section. The figures were grim, but not fatal. 12 Beetles destroyed, 3 Phoenixes cracked along their seams, 2 roadways collapsed. Yet supply flow had resumed before sunrise. A Liberty ship named James Gordon Bennett lay moored to Pierhead 2, unloading crates of ammunition at a steady pace, 30 tons per hour. The system groaned under strain but continued to function. The first task was stabilization. Divers inspected the base of each damaged caisson, marking leaks with red dye that spread into the water like smoke. Concrete pumps on barges injected quick-set grout into the cracks. On the floating roads, engineers replaced warped spans with spare segments stored on lighters offshore. Welding torches flickered blue against the gray dawn. Each repair followed procedure developed months earlier in British shipyards. Clean, cut, align, weld, test. There was no improvisation left, only process. The sea allowed just 90 minutes of calm before rising again with the tide. At 700, a group of German artillery pieces opened fire from the cliffs east of Port-en-Bessin. Shells whistled overhead, landing short in the water. The gunners on the shore battery replied within minutes. A gun duel flared across the bay, invisible through the fog except for the orange flashes. The engineers kept working, crouched low but unmoved. One shell landed near the outermost pierhead, drenching the crew with spray and fragments. No one stopped. West noted the incident with a single line in his log. Harbor under intermittent fire operations continue. By late morning, the first convoy of supply trucks formed along the pier. British and Canadian drivers waited in single file, engines idling. Military police directed them forward with hand signals, keeping an exact interval of 40 feet between vehicles to balance weight on the floating roadway. The trucks carried fuel, rations, and small arms ammunition destined for units pushing inland toward Caen. Each crossing took 7 minutes. At full rhythm, the harbor could process one truck every 45 seconds. The mathematics became as important as courage. Logistics determined victory now. At noon, a dispatch arrived from Allied headquarters in Portsmouth confirming what West already suspected. The American Mulberry at Omaha had been destroyed beyond repair. The storm had torn it apart, scattering caissons and pontoon sections across the bay. From now on, Arromanches would handle all artificial harbor operations for the Allied front in Normandy. The load would triple. Orders came to expand capacity, immediately extend the eastern pier, add 2 new pierheads, and reinforce every mooring. The news brought no celebration. It meant continuous labor under pressure none had imagined. The afternoon passed in coordinated chaos. Cranes lifted new spans into place, while tugboats towed fresh beetles from offshore reserves. Supply ships arrived in unbroken succession. Every available engineer, diver, and mechanic joined the effort. By 1,700, the sea was crowded with vessels maneuvering within feet of each other, tugs, barges, landing craft, and floating cranes all operating in the narrow basin. From the cliffs above, French villagers watched in disbelief as the harbor expanded hour by hour, its steel veins stretching outward into the sea. At 1,830, West climbed the command platform overlooking the new eastern wall. Below him, men in oilskins moved with mechanical precision. The air stank of diesel exhaust and hot metal. Beyond the breakwater, gray waves rolled harmlessly against the phoenixes. Inside, the water lay almost still. 2 Liberty ships were unloading side by side now, their cranes synchronized in slow arcs. Each drop delivered another jeep, another stack of shells, another crate of rations. In 24 hours, nearly 7,000 tons had come ashore, the target finally reached. After dusk, the harbor lights came on for the first time. Strung along the pierheads, their dim bulbs cast a yellow reflection across the calm water. West stood with his logbook under his arm, watching the pattern of movement, the trucks rolling, cranes swinging, men guiding cables by lantern. The channel wind had turned warm again, carrying the smell of oil and wet wood. The channel tide, running at nearly 5 knots, tried to drag the hulks off position. Mooring cables groaned and snapped. West marked them one by one, scuttled 615, settled upright, visibility poor. His handwriting shook but stayed legible. Behind the first line came the Phoenix's enormous concrete caissons, built in secrecy along the British coast. Each weighed up to 6,000 tons. They had been designed to sink themselves in controlled stages by flooding internal chambers. Tug crews called them monsters, 40-foot-high walls with nothing but numbers painted on their flanks. He thought briefly of the men at Dieppe 2 years earlier, the slaughter that had proved how impossible a direct harbor assault could be. That failure had made this moment inevitable. What could not be taken had been built instead, one section at a time, towed through storms and fire until it stood complete. The laughter that had greeted Mountbatten's first proposal was gone now, drowned by the sound of machinery feeding an army. The impossible harbor was real, and it was working. June 12th, 1944. The wind shifted westward again, bringing low clouds and a steady drizzle that soaked every surface. Lieutenant Commander Harold West began his inspection at 430, moving along the outer caissons in a small launch. The sea was calm for the moment, but the swell from the previous storm had left scars. Concrete faces were chipped and pitted, steel plates bent like paper. Men in khaki and navy blue moved along the decks, tightening bolts, hammering wedges, and measuring stress points with plumb lines. Every hour spent on repair was an hour stolen from unloading, but the harbor had to be secured before the next blow. The night before, the first pipeline section from the Pluto project had been connected to the pierhead. A narrow steel tube coiled along the seabed, designed to carry fuel directly from tank farms in southern England. The engineers had called it Pipeline Under the Ocean. For now, only test pressure flowed through it, but within weeks it would pump hundreds of tons of petrol per day. West watched the gauges as the pressure needle steadied, then climbed. The idea that gasoline could cross the channel unseen seemed as improbable as the harbor itself, yet here it was, another invention made real by necessity. By mid-morning, the unloading schedule resumed. The supply column reached 4 miles inland by 1,000 hours. Trucks rolled across the whale roads in a constant stream. Each vehicle carried stamped manifests, artillery shells, aviation fuel, rations, field telephones. The harbor's cranes swung methodically from dawn until dark. Every few minutes, another crate hit the pier with a hollow thud, another cargo net lifted empty. The figures from headquarters arrived over radio total landed since June 7th. 40,000 tons. The port of Cherbourg was still under German control, its harbor mined and blockaded. Until it fell, this assembly of steel and concrete remained the only artery feeding the Allied advance. At 1,200, an engineer named Sergeant Kenneth Price brought West a clipboard of damage reports. 3 caissons along the western arm had developed hairline cracks, likely from uneven settling. Divers would attempt underwater reinforcement at low tide that evening. Another note detailed the failure of 2 Beetle pontoons due to stress corrosion. Replacement pontoons were already being welded aboard the repair barge Swansea Queen. The routine had become relentless. nothing was theoretical anymore. Every decision carried immediate physical consequence. The weather worsened in the afternoon. The drizzle thickened into fog, obscuring the coastline. Ship horns groaned in the mist. Convoy signals blinked faintly across the water, guiding the next wave of transports into position. One Liberty ship grounded briefly on the sandbar before tugs pulled her free. The operation continued without pause. On the beach, bulldozers worked through mud to expand the road network leading inland. Every minute, trucks left loaded. Every hour, more equipment arrived to take their place. War was no longer measured in battles, but in tonnage. At 1,730, a delegation from the British War Office arrived unannounced by motor launch. They toured the harbor in silence, rain dripping from their coats. West guided them past the pierheads, explaining ballast adjustments, tidal variations, and tonnage flow. One of the officials asked if the harbor would survive another gale. West answered evenly. If we hold our moorings and maintain the outer wall, yes. If not, it will fail in 12 hours. The man nodded and made no further comment. Before leaving, he said only, "London didn't believe this was possible. They do now." That evening, the rain stopped. The tide receded, exposing the lower halves of the caissons. Mechanics climbed down with lamps to inspect the concrete seams. The air smelled of salt and ozone. Somewhere inland, artillery thundered faint, steady, rhythmic. The front was moving east toward Caen. Supplies from the harbor were already fueling that advance. The chain from ship to shore to front was unbroken for the first time. At 2,200, West returned to his cabin aboard Bulldog. The day's log filled 2 pages. Temperature, wind direction, barometric pressure, tonnage landed, losses minimal. He added one final note before closing the book. Harbor functioning beyond design, morale steady, personnel exhausted but effective. He turned off the lamp and listened to the muffled sounds outside diesel engines, waves lapping against concrete, the clang of a hammer somewhere in the dark. In the stillness, he realized that the impossible idea proposed in a London conference room 2 years earlier now carried an entire army across Europe. The harbor was no longer an experiment. It was a living machine. Every creak of steel, every echo of a crane, every ripple of fuel through the Pluto line marked its heartbeat. The war's outcome no longer depended on theory. It depended on this floating port, built by men who refused to accept what could not be done. June 15th, 1944. The morning fog burned away slowly, revealing a flat gray horizon, and the pale outlines of ships anchored beyond the breakwater. The harbor had settled into rhythm. Cranes moved in steady arcs. Tugs idled with exhaust, curling into the still air. By 800, the first Phoenix reached the line. A naval engineer opened flood valves while men scrambled clear. The structure groaned, shuddered, and disappeared beneath the surface, settling neatly into place beside the block ships. When the tide fell 6 hours later, its flat top would form part of the harbor wall. To seaward, another formation waited Wales, the floating roadways. Made of steel spans resting on pontoons called beetles, they would link the pierheads to the shore. Each section was 80 feet long, flexible enough to ride the waves, yet strong enough to carry loaded trucks. Lieutenant Commander Harold West stood on the pierhead, coffee mug in hand, watching a convoy of tank transporters roll down the floating road toward shore. The sound was mechanical, almost soothing chains clinking, steel joints creaking, diesel engines humming in unison. For the first time in a week, the sea was calm enough to reflect the sky. At 700, the daily report from Portsmouth arrived by radio. The first permanent port facilities at Cherbourg were still contested, and enemy demolitions had rendered its quays useless. Until those docks were cleared, Mulberry B remained the main supply artery. West's orders were simple: increase capacity to 9,000 tons per day by adding 2 new pierheads. The engineers received the instruction without surprise. They had built through storms, under fire, and without sleep. Another expansion was routine. Barges loaded with additional whale spans waited offshore, each section marked in chalk with its destination. By mid-morning, divers entered the water to inspect the anchorage floor for the new pierhead foundations. The tide was slack, the current minimal. Using handheld sonar, they mapped the seabed and marked locations with floating buoys. Above them, a crane barge positioned the first support legs. The operation required exact timing. If the pierhead was lowered too early, it would settle unevenly. Too late, the rising tide would lift it free. West coordinated the sequence by radio from a small observation tower, giving orders in clipped, measured phrases. Flood chamber 2, hold valve 3, lower another 6 feet. His tone never rose above conversation level. By 1,200, the first new pierhead rested securely in place. The second followed by dusk. Each one represented another link in the logistical chain that stretched from English factories to the hedgerows of Normandy. The figures from headquarters showed that every infantry division ashore consumed roughly 700 tons of supplies daily. Fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts all passed through this floating harbor. The mathematics were simple. If Mulberry B failed, the offensive would halt within a week. The engineers worked with that knowledge in silence, adjusting cables, welding joints, checking levels. At 1,500, the first enemy aircraft appeared over the coast. A formation of Focke-Wulf fighters dropped from the clouds, strafing the harbor in a shallow dive. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire from the block ships, tracers cutting across the sky. One plane released a single bomb that struck the water near the breakwater, sending a column of spray into the air. Shrapnel rattled against the caissons like hail. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. When the last echo faded, work resumed immediately. The only casualty was a signalman, wounded in the arm. The medical team treated him on the spot. Through the evening, the loading schedule continued. By 1,800, the day's total tonnage surpassed 8,400, nearly the new target. The figures astonished even the planners in London. Liberty ships no longer waited in queue. The rhythm of unloading had reached industrial tempo. Supplies flowed from hulls to shore without pause. The Mulberry had become a true port, its movements dictated by tide tables and mechanical precision rather than improvisation. West walked the length of Pierhead 3, noting each station fuel drums stacked in grids, cranes swinging methodically, trucks idling in exact formation. Everything had found its order. After sunset, a brief calm settled. The channel's surface shimmered faintly under the half-moon. The men on duty smoked quietly, leaning against the rails, their faces lit by the red glow of cigarettes. For the first time, the harbor looked permanent, though everyone knew it was not. It had no foundations in rock, no stone walls, no permanence beyond the tides that held it. Yet for the moment, It felt solid enough to support an entire invasion. Shortly before midnight, West climbed the ladder to the signal platform. From there, he could see the faint lights of hundreds of ships offshore. Convoys stretched to the horizon: tankers, transports, hospital ships, tugs. Their outlines formed a floating city. The realization came slowly, almost without pride. They had built the greatest harbor in the world, and it floated. Every mile of that city existed because men had refused to accept that the sea was impassable. He closed his log for the night, the wind rising slightly from the west, and turned toward the darkened shore, where the rumble of artillery marked the line of battle moving inland. June 18th, 1944. The barometer fell sharply overnight, and by dawn the first signs of trouble showed on the horizon. A low swell from the northwest deepened with each hour. The harbor, quiet for days, began to groan again under pressure. Lieutenant Commander Harold West stood in the control hut above Pierhead 2, staring at the gray line of approaching clouds. Wind streaks flattened the sea surface into long, white trails. The meteorological officer handed him the forecast gale force winds within 12 hours. West read it once, folded the paper, and gave the order to secure every mooring and prepare for emergency ballast flooding. By 800, the wind had reached 30 knots. Crews worked along the breakwater, driving steel pins into the caissons and tightening cables already stretched to their limit. Waves began to roll through the outer gaps, lifting the beetles and flexing the whale spans like joints in a living creature. Each impact sent a metallic shudder through the roadways. Tugs moved continuously, repositioning barges and hauling in drifting pontoons. Every voice on the radio carried the same clipped-tone reports of strain, of anchors dragging, of cables parting, one after another. The mathematics of their load limits 25 tons per span had been checked by every engineer from Portsmouth to Glasgow. Yet no one knew if the system would survive real seas. As the tugs eased them forward, German artillery found range again. Shells splashed among the pontoons. 2 beetles capsized, dragging a span down. A Royal Engineer sergeant marked the loss and signaled the next section to move up. The process continued without pause. By noon, the wind shifted northwest. A squall rolled in, hammering the half-finished harbor. Waves climbed over the caissons, tossing landing craft like driftwood. The harbor that had survived the first storm was about to face something worse. By noon, visibility dropped to less than half a mile. Rain swept sideways across the decks. The sea turned white. Phoenix caissons, each weighing thousands of tons, shifted under the assault, dragging their anchors and grinding against each other. The sound was deep and slow, like collapsing masonry. On the pierheads, men fought to keep the floating roads attached. One pontoon tore free and vanished into the surf. Another slammed against a caisson, twisting the roadway until it split in 2. Orders came to disconnect the outer sections before the strain ripped the entire system apart. West watched from the control tower as crews crawled along the slick surfaces, cutting loose spans that cost months to build. At 1,500, the storm reached its peak. Winds gusted to 70 miles per hour. The sea rose in gray walls that broke across the harbor, smashing against concrete and steel. The noise drowned out engines and voices alike. 2 Liberty ships broke their moorings and drifted toward the beach, hulls grinding over the shallows until they grounded hard on the sand. One began to list immediately. water pouring through a rent in her side. Another beetle disappeared beneath a crest, leaving only fragments of its frame floating among the wreckage. West could do nothing but record the losses in pencil, as the pages of his logbook soaked through with rain. By evening, it was clear that Mulberry B would not escape undamaged. Half of the outer wall had shifted, roadways twisted or torn, a third of the pierheads gone, yet the harbor still absorbed the storm's force, protecting the landing beaches behind it. On the radio, British and American voices merged in a constant stream requests for tugs, updates on flooding rates, casualty reports. When darkness fell, the wind howled through the hollow steel sections like an organ. No one slept. Crews moved along the decks, with lanterns tied to their belts, securing lines again and again, knowing most would snap by morning. At 300 on June 19th, a caisson designated Phoenix 33 cracked along its center seam and began to sink. The engineers tried to stabilize it by pumping air into the chambers, but the internal valves had jammed with silt. Within 20 minutes, the massive block rolled sideways and vanished beneath the surface, leaving a gap 200 feet wide in the breakwater. Through that opening, the full force of the sea entered the harbor. The remaining structures shuddered but held. When dawn came, the wind eased only slightly. The sky hung low and yellow, filled with spray. The damage was catastrophic but contained. Dozens of roadways lay twisted and half submerged. Sunken caissons marked the line where the wall had been. Yet behind them, on the beach, hundreds of vehicles stood unharmed. The harbor had sacrificed itself to shield the landing zone. West climbed the ladder to the ruined pierhead, rain still blowing in sheets, and looked out across the wreckage. He felt no triumph, no despair, only fatigue. By afternoon, the sea began to settle. The engineers counted the cost: 14 caissons lost, 6 pierheads destroyed, nearly half the floating roads beyond repair. But even in its broken state, the harbor had done its work. It had landed more than 140,000 tons of supplies in 10 days, enough to sustain the Allied push inland until permanent ports could be opened. The men understood that. No orders were given to rebuild. Instead, they salvaged what could float and reinforced what still held, turning wreckage into a barrier strong enough to finish the job. That night, when the last waves struck the shattered walls, West wrote one final entry for the day. Harbor battered, but not beaten. Function to be maintained as long as materials permit. Then he closed his notebook and watched the surf batter the steel that had carried an army across the sea. The impossible harbor had done the one thing it was built for: endure. June 21st, 1944. The storm was gone, leaving behind a calm sea filled with wreckage. The air carried the sour smell of oil and salt. Pieces of roadway floated half-submerged, bumping against each other in the slow tide. Lieutenant Commander Harold West and his small launch moved through the debris field, charting what could be salvaged. A crewman leaned over the side with a boat hook, tagging fragments with bright paint. Every section recovered meant steel that wouldn't have to cross the channel again. The harbor was quiet except for the low groan of damaged caissons settling deeper into the sand. The sea, now flat and reflective, gave no hint of the violence that had destroyed half of Mulberry B. Phoenix. 33's wreck still marked the western gap, a jagged edge of concrete protruding above the surface. Divers worked there from dawn, cutting away twisted rebar and sealing leaks with bags of quick-drying cement. They moved slowly, guided by hand signals, visibility down to a few feet. The water near the wreck shimmered with diesel from ruptured tanks. By mid-morning, the surviving roadways had been reconnected in makeshift fashion. Steel beams scavenged from broken spans were bolted in place, forming rough bridges between intact beetles. The angles were uneven, the surfaces crooked, but the lines of movement were open again. Trucks began rolling cautiously across the patched roads by 1,100 hours, their wheels clattering against the steel decking. Each vehicle carried supplies toward the beach fuel drums, crates of rations, boxes of medical gear. West watched from the control hut as the first convoy crossed the repaired section. The improvised harbor still lived. The day's orders came over the radio from Portsmouth. Maintain operations at reduced capacity. No new construction authorized. Prioritize unloading of ammunition and medical cargo. The message confirmed what everyone already knew: the storm had ended expansion. The harbor would serve as long as it could, then be left to the tides. West said nothing. He passed the order down the line and continued his inspection. Men worked with a kind of mechanical patience, tightening bolts, replacing planks, cleaning filters. There was no talk of rebuilding. The war had moved inland. Their task was to hold the line between sea and shore until the real ports opened. At 1,400, a column of soldiers marched across the beach toward the front, rifles slung, packs heavy. Some stopped to watch the floating roads, the motion of trucks moving across the water. To them, it looked impossible. One corporal saluted the engineers as he passed. No one responded. They were too busy securing another span that had started to buckle in the midday sun. The metal creaked under stress, expanding in the heat. A welder crouched on the joint, sparks flashing around his boots. In the afternoon, the weather turned warm and clear. For the first time since D-Day, sunlight spread across the harbor without haze. From the cliffs above Oromanches, the pattern of the entire structure was visible: the great arc of caissons, the patchwork of beetles, the half-finished pierheads still standing like ribs of a skeleton. Ships waited beyond the breakwater, patient silhouettes against the horizon. Despite its ruin, the harbor continued to receive and deliver. Cargoes moved ashore in an unbroken rhythm, smaller but steady. At 1,700, West walked to the end of Pierhead 3. The deck beneath him was dented and stained, but the structure held. The tide was falling, and the smell of exposed mud drifted over the water. He watched as the last truck of the day rolled off the pier and onto the sand, leaving wet tracks behind it. The driver gave a brief wave without slowing down. The sound of the engine faded toward the interior, swallowed by the hills where the guns thundered far away. That evening, a dispatch arrived from headquarters announcing the capture of Cherbourg. The harbor there was wrecked but salvageable. Within weeks, supplies would begin flowing through a permanent port. The man around West read the message in silence. There was no ceremony, no relief, only the understanding that their work would soon be over. The floating port that had carried an invasion would be left to rust. After nightfall, West stayed on deck. The tide lapped quietly against the caissons. Signal lamps blinked from ships offshore, faint points of light across the black water. He thought of the first day, the laughter in London when the idea had been dismissed as madness. Now that madness had fed an army, shielded a beachhead, and endured 2 storms. It would fade soon, dismantled by time and tide. But for now, it still functioned. West closed his notebook and listened to the sea pressing gently against the steel walls that had once defied it. June 25th, 1000, 944. The tide moved lazily through the gaps in the breakwater, lifting and lowering the remains of the harbor with a steady pulse. The war had advanced beyond the beaches now, but Arromanches still breathed with the rhythm of trucks, cranes, and men. Lieutenant Commander Harold West walked the length of the remaining pier at first light, his boots echoing on the warped steel plates. In the distance, artillery from Caen rumbled like distant thunder. The front had moved 20 miles inland, yet every shell fired there depended on what crossed this floating port. By 700, the first convoy of the day arrived 3 Liberty ships and a tanker escorted by small trawlers. Their hulls were streaked with rust and salt, their crews hollow-eyed from weeks of continuous work. The unloading began immediately. Cranes swung cargo nets of ammunition and spare parts, stacking them with mechanical precision on the waiting roadways. The work was slower now. Many of the beetles creaked with age, their joints bent from storm damage. Each step of a truck made the spans tremble. The men timed movement with the tide, loading heavy vehicles only at high water when the stress was lowest. The records showed what the engineers already felt in their bones. The harbor had delivered more than 320,000 tons since D-Day. Fuel, food, munitions, vehicles all landed through a structure never meant to last more than weeks. Every ton moved ashore had cost sweat, sleeplessness, and sometimes lives. West reviewed the figures on his clipboard, drawing a single line beneath them. No one mentioned the achievement. There was no time. Another storm warning had arrived at dawn, though weaker than the last. The sea outside the breakwater looked calm, but the wind carried the smell of weather from the west. By midday, divers surfaced from their inspection of the damaged caissons. They reported settlement on the southern arm, one Phoenix tilting inward by several degrees. Pumps were installed to relieve pressure in the chambers, while sandbags and scrap metal were dropped to reinforce the base. The process was slow, conducted by men who had learned every sound the harbor made. A groan from the steel deck meant a loose joint. A thud beneath the hull meant ballast shifting. They worked with the focus of surgeons. Every repair extended the harbor's life by another day. At 1,400, the first vehicles from Cherbourg began arriving by road convoy. The city's port remained blocked, but Allied engineers had cleared one small jetty. Within a week, Arromanches would no longer be the sole entry point for supplies. The men heard the news without comment. They simply nodded and continued tightening bolts, coiling ropes, cleaning filters. Their purpose was clear: to keep this port alive until others could take its place. The afternoon passed under a thin sun. The channel lay smooth and glassy, its calm deceptive. West stood near the edge of the pier watching the horizon where ships waited to unload. Beyond them, the outline of England blurred in haze. He thought of the journey each cargo made, from factories in Birmingham and Glasgow to assembly yards at Southampton, across 80 miles of sea, through storm and fire to reach this fragile bridge of steel and tide. No plan, no weapon, no commander could have replaced the simple persistence that kept those convoys moving. As evening came, a faint wind returned. The surface darkened, rippling gently against the caissons. Lamps flickered on along the pierheads, their reflections wavering on the water. Men ate in silence beside the cranes, their mess tins balanced on crates. The noise never stopped the distant clank of chains, the hiss of pumps, the steady churn of engines offshore. The harbor was smaller now, but it remained alive, its purpose unchanged. After dark, West climbed to the observation platform one last time. From there, the pattern of lights stretched in a broken curve across the bay, the remains of a dream that had once seemed impossible. The sea was calm again, as if resting after its fury. He opened his notebook, wrote a single line, "Function sustained beyond expectation," and closed it. The war had moved inland, but the harbor would stay until the last load was delivered. What had begun as laughter in a London conference room had become iron, salt, and endurance. July 10th, 1944. The morning sky was pale and windless, the sea as smooth as glass. Only fragments of the old harbor remained, half of the caissons sunk in place, their tops marked with rust and barnacles. The floating roads had been dismantled, their usable spans towed to Cherbourg and Le Havre. Where thousands of men once labored, only a handful of maintenance crews remained, their duties reduced to inspection and salvage. Lieutenant Commander Harold West stood on the deck of a small launch, looking across the quiet bay that had once been alive with the sound of cranes and engines. The invasion front was far away now. The harbor's purpose was finished. By mid-morning, teams began removing signal buoys and dismantling the last moorings. Divers worked in pairs, cutting the heavy anchor chains that had held the Phoenixes in line since early June. Each cut sent a hollow metallic echo through the water. Some caissons, too damaged to tow, were left where they stood. They would serve as a permanent breakwater for the fishing boats already returning to the coast. The engineers moved carefully, as if reluctant to erase their own work. The tide was gentle, the channel indifferent. At 1,100, the final convoy of small craft arrived from Portsmouth carrying equipment for recovery. Portable generators, acetylene tanks, and cranes were offloaded onto the remains of Pierhead 2, the same platform that had received the first truck on June 7th. Its deck was warped, edges corroded, but it held. West signed the inventory forms and gave quiet instructions. Every item recovered was tagged and listed. Nothing was wasted, not even the rusted bolts. The war had already consumed enough. Around noon, a message came over the wireless from Allied headquarters. Cherbourg's harbor was fully operational. Supply throughput exceeded all estimates. Arromanches was officially decommissioned. The radio operator read the message twice before setting it down. West gave no order, just nodded once. The men went back to work without ceremony. They knew what the words meant. The floating port that had made invasion possible was now history. In the afternoon, clouds gathered over the channel, though the wind remained soft. The crews finished dismantling the last remaining whale roadway, guiding its sections toward the waiting tugs. The operation took 6 hours. The order came to anchor the pierheads. Each consisted of a 200-foot pontoon platform with adjustable legs meant to rise and fall with the tide. The first was code-named Spud No. 3. It took 12 hours and 3 attempts to fix it in place. When the storm eased at dusk, the skeletal outline of a harbor stretched from the beach nearly a mile offshore, imperfect but alive. West walked the deck as dusk fell, noting the silence between gunfire. Far astern, the convoy of Liberty ships waited for the signal to unload. Over 2. When the final span was lifted clear, only open water lay between the shore and the line of sunken caissons. The shape of the harbor still showed faintly from above, a crescent of steel and concrete curving around the bay. Its symmetry, even in ruin, was unmistakable. At dusk, West walked alone along the beach. The tide had receded, exposing fragments of metal half buried in the sand. Children from the nearby village played among them, their laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. Beyond the waterline, pieces of the old pier jutted from the shallows, dark silhouettes against the orange light. He paused by one of the caissons and touched the rough surface, its concrete pitted with shrapnel and salt. It was cold and solid beneath his hand, as real as the memory of the men who had built it. When darkness came, the launch's engine started for the last time. West stood at the stern as it pulled away, watching the coastline shrink behind him. The lights of Arromanches flickered faintly through the mist, reflected on the calm surface of the sea. Out ahead, England waited across the horizon, invisible but certain. The voyage back would take 6 hours at slow speed. As the distance grew, the remnants of the harbor blended with the shoreline until they became one continuous shadow. What had once been an audacious plan drawn on paper now lay silent beneath the tide. It had fulfilled its purpose completely, then surrendered itself to the sea. West closed his logbook without writing, knowing there was nothing left to record. The harbor no longer belonged to the engineers who built it, or the soldiers who depended on it. It belonged to history now, resting quietly in the channel, its work finished. 5 million tons of supplies were scheduled to pass through these makeshift ports in the first 90 days. Each Liberty carried 10,000 tons of cargo fuel, rations, trucks, ammunition. The math was unforgiving. Without a working harbor, the invasion would consume its beachhead faster than supply could land through surf. Every phoenix, every roadway, every block ship mattered. Shortly before midnight, West joined Commander Alan Beck in the chart room. Both men studied the tidal predictions for the next morning. The spring tide would rise another 6 feet, enough to test the caisson's seals. Beck traced the shoreline with a pencil. If we lose 2 more in the West Gap, we'll have a breach. West nodded. We'll plug it with the spare from Section D, tow at first light. The conversation ended there. Orders, adjustments, no speculation. Across the channel, German observers at Longues-sur-Mer reported artificial structures offshore. Their messages reached the 716th Infantry Division headquarters at Bayeux by 200. Colonel Helmuth Marx dismissed them as wrecked ships. His staff laughed at the idea of an entire harbor towed across the sea,